Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. If you live in a Western democracy, then one of the things that I think is becoming more and more apparent to common citizens is that no matter who you vote for, and a lot of these Western democracies have these large two-party systems where you have a bunch of smaller parties, but really, who's going to be in government is either one of two big parties. In the United States, that is going to be the Republicans or the Democrats. In Australia, it is going to be Labour or Liberal. And one of these things is that no matter who you vote for, on certain issues like housing, immigration, border protection, funding foreign wars, that no matter who you vote for in either party, there's going to be certain core issues which, no matter what the general opinion of the majority of the population is, that the position of the government will not really change regardless of who comes into power. And I think the reason for this effect, and one thing that a lot of people discount, is that even though in school, and if you're in a Western country, generally it will be part of your curriculum somewhere to teach you how the democracy you live in works, is that you're always taught that as a citizen of this country, you get to vote in different elections and you can have different types of government. In Australia, we have local, state, and federal, and people get elected for different lengths of time. But the whole premise is that in your constituency, so in the kind of block, the geographical area that you vote in, so different levels of government are broken up into different blocks. If the majority of that block votes for a particular party or a candidate of that party, then that person will be elected and they will be able to represent you on your behalf. And the whole concept is that you as an individual have a whole lot of power in how your country is run. But I think what we're increasingly noticing now is that despite the majority of people having a particular opinion on certain issues, it seems to be that the government will go in the complete opposite way. And the reason for this is I truly believe the power of our vote and the ability of us to make our voices heard at the ballot box has been significantly diluted by the role of corporate lobbyists, of think tank lobbyists, of companies who want to promote certain agendas or certain laws so they can build a moat for their businesses and ensure that there's a steady stream of customers coming in or lowering wages. And there are all these big, well-funded groups who have certain stances that they would like the government to adopt, despite those stances being in contradiction to what the majority of the population would actually like to see their government doing. So we have these odd situations where your schools and hospitals are going unfunded, but we've got money to send overseas to fight in foreign wars that have nothing to really do with our Western countries, like things that are happening in the Middle East, things that are happening in Ukraine. And whilst, yes, those are horrible things, and if I could press a button and stop all war, I absolutely would, people are going to fight regardless. So why should we be spending our taxpayer dollars funding foreign wars when we have so many issues at home? And the reason is we have these huge companies and these huge lobby groups who are deciding on our behalf of how our government should be run. And they are generally funding, every time there's an election cycle, if a candidate goes against the policy stances that their lobbyists would like them to take, they lose funding. And so they become dependent. And we now have a very compromised government. We have a compromised system of government in the West. One of the revelations that has come out, and I'm not going to talk about this in this episode, but for those of you who are interested, I would Google Thomas Massie, who's a Republican senator, I believe, and I would go listen to his revelations on Carlson Tucker's show. So type in Thomas Massie, Carlson Tucker on YouTube, and it is scary to see that every Republican senator in the United States fundamentally has a foreign handler. And that is a very scary thought, to think that there are foreign governments who can exert control over your domestic politics. And that is an incredibly scary thing. But this is very legal, and this seems to happen, and it really does need to change. And the role of these corporate lobbyists is that we are losing the power of our vote. And I've definitely worked for companies where part of the business strategy is to actually make sure you get to the capital and make sure these laws are passed and make sure they're favorable for your business, which is not inherently a bad thing. But you can see when super large companies, when giant monopolies start doing this, it can be incredibly anti-competitive for the economy, for the people, for new businesses that might want to start in a certain area. It's a very slippery slope to go down. And I've learnt, if there's one lesson I learned from being in Sri Lanka in 2022 in July, and I was very fortunate to be there, is that there was an economic crisis in Sri Lanka and the common people got to the streets. And I'm by no means, I'm not a common person. Like, I'm not a common everyday Sri Lankan. I'm somebody who is from Australia. I do not face the same issues that these people face. I had the privilege of being able to join them in the streets and see people from different walks of life get together and oust their president. And for the most part, it was a non-violent thing. Unfortunately, with all of these movements, they can be tarred by acts. During the Sri Lankan protests, the Prime Minister's house was burnt down, which is horrible because it really tarnishes the role of the movement. I think one of the things that I really respect in history is Mahatma Gandhi's non-violence, the satyagraha, the salt marches, where he was very strict on the fact that we are not going to resist, we are not going to fight, we are just going to make our will known. We think that the whole idea of the British taxing us on salt production is very unfair. And so we're going to march a few hundred kilometers and illegally manufacture salt. But if anyone tries to harm us, we're not going to fight back because that's not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to make our will known, the will of the common people. And so I think in Western democracies, the time has come for non-violent movement. And we can see that politics is getting very jarred. We just had a assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump while he was campaigning, and it's a very messy place. And I think there is a huge role for non-violence in politics. But this needs to happen outside of the ballot box because it's very clear that no matter how people keep voting, it is the will of the lobby groups. And in America, they call these super PACs. And I think the word PAC is like a political action committee. And it's basically groups who get to fund candidates and fund elections and decide, if a candidate disagrees with them, we're not going to fund them. We're going to put somebody else up and make sure that we slander them and make sure that our guy gets in. And it's a very interesting type of dynamic. And so I think the development of non-violence movements in the West has to be outside of the ballot box because it's clear that the system is not delivering results for the majority of people. It is delivering results for the very vocal, very powerful, very well-funded minorities. And that is simply not going to work going to the future. So from history, one of the very interesting lessons we can learn from the late Roman Empire is the secession of the plebs, or Secessio Plebis. And the beauty of Secessio Plebis, or secession of the plebeians, or withdrawal of the commoners, is their idea of a kind of non-violent movement was, we are going to exit the city. We are going to leave our population centers for a set amount of time, just so our leaders can feel the impact of us not being there. So imagine if everyone in Australia, and there's going to be lots of logistical feasibilities to this, said we are just going to go camping outside our capital cities, or maybe we're just going to stay at home. We're going to stock up food for a week and we're just going to stay at home and have backyard barbecues and invite our friends, and we are just not going to participate in society for a set period of time, just so our politicians are made aware of the presence, of the power of the common people when they decide to act as a unified body. And that is what I saw in Sri Lanka. And whilst there are still problems in Sri Lanka, I did witness the fact that there were people who have felt very powerless their whole lives, and simply by the act of leaving their homes, getting out to the streets and marching, now that's a more active form of protest, they were able to change the course of their country's history and the course of their government. But I think there's another step to that. You don't need to go and actively protest and make chants and expend energy. You can simply withdraw from the public, from the commercial arena collectively for a set amount of time, like the ancient Roman plebeians did. And by doing so, and they did this 5 times from 494 BC to 287 BC, so starting from about 2,500 years ago, about 300 years after that, they were able to make their voices heard by withdrawing from society. And these are the people who were responsible for food production, for security. And as soon as they withdrew, their politicians went, oh shit, there's something happening here. The aristocracy realized that we're actually going to have to go and bargain with these people and hear their concerns. So really, in this particular episode, I wanted to revisit the concept of the secession of the plebs, Secessio Plebis, as an ancient tool for the modern ages. Because if we look at how our Western democracies are being run, the voices of the common people are increasingly being heard less and less as lobbying from both the corporate sector, from other political interest groups, and scarily sometimes from foreign interest groups, are dictating the direction of government as opposed to the will of the common people. And that is a very, very scary thing for Western democracies. And I think this is why people are becoming increasingly disillusioned with no matter how they vote, it goes another way. And the funny thing is, I see people complaining about this. Oh, people are going to the far left or the far right. Yes, that's because they realize that voting for the major parties is doing nothing. And these major parties are taking funding from their major donors and doing the will of their major donors. And then you see people who are busy lobbying, people who are funding politicians, then complaining that people are going far left and far right. Yeah, of course. Are you bloody stupid? Are you unable to see the second and third order consequences of the system that you are supporting? And so until such laws change, and there have been laws that have been proposed in Western democracies, I think one of the very interesting ones is there is a Republican called Ro Khanna, and he proposed a no PAC bill. So the end of kind of super PAC funding. So a PAC is a political action committee. And so his idea was that we shouldn't have large amounts of money being injected into our political system, because then that controls how our leaders think. And so Ro Khanna, a Democrat, had this anti-super PAC policy. And it didn't go through. It hasn't gone through, of course, because America is all about the PACs. And interestingly, this is something that could easily have bipartisan support. In fact, I remember Vivek Ramaswamy, who ran as a Republican candidate, he basically said that, me and Ro Khanna, we disagree on many, many, many policy objectives. But on the idea that we should get super PACs out of our government, that is something we can agree on. And that's something that I think is very powerful. The idea of changing the way that lobbying can work. Like, should we be allowing corporate and foreign lobbyists to influence our policy decisions? And as I said, if you're interested, Google Thomas Massie, Google Carson Tucker, type it in, Thomas Massie, Carson Tucker, stick it on YouTube and watch Thomas Massie speak about how every Republican senator, I believe it's senators in the United States, has a foreign handler. And it is absolutely shocking. And if it's on the Republican side, chances are exactly the same thing will exist for the Democrats. And it makes it very clear that no matter how you vote, you're often voting for the exact same policy decisions, because these big lobby groups, these big corporate lobbyists, these political think tanks, certain foreign governments will fund both sides of the political spectrum to make sure that their will is implemented. And that unfortunately means that your vote, when you go to the ballot, is diluted. And I am never going to recommend violence. There is so much that can be achieved without violence. Just like Gandhi did, just like the Roman plebeians did, being able to withdraw non-violent civil disobedience maybe is the solution for Western democracies. And maybe this is a tool that we need to bring back. So hopefully this has been some food for thought. I think one of the things that I find very sad, especially with people my own age, is the general political disenfranchisement. General people who just work jobs and have careers, and maybe they're not even that average, but they feel so disenfranchised in that they don't want to have political views because they're like, we're not rich, we're not powerful. What difference is it going to make if we have these views? And I think that's a very, very unfortunate thing to hold. If there's anything I learned from being in Sri Lanka in 2022 is that the common person, I saw people who barely have enough clothes to cover their back being able to get on the street, and they didn't use violence, and not by using violence. Of course, a small minority did, but the vast majority of people, simply by being able to be civilly disobedient, by breaking a curfew that was meant to stop them from walking on the streets, and by coming into the nation's capital and making their voices heard, they were able to enact change. And for the people of the world, I think if you feel disenfranchised, if you feel like your leaders are not paying heed to your concerns because they have been bought over by corporate and foreign interest groups, you can make your voice heard through non-violent civil disobedience. And we should be learning from the Romans, and maybe that is a tool that we can use, because a protest is very exhausting to go out there and scream and march. But if we were to simply collectively withdraw from society, from our capital cities, and make it very clear to our politicians that your lives are going to be made hard. Because when you need food now, when you need somebody to make your coffee in the morning, that person is not going to be there. That is the only way to make our political leaders realize that they do indeed need to represent the majority. And that is the only way that we are going to enact change, I believe, because the way that things are going, it just looks like the people are becoming more and more powerless every passing year, and people feel more disenfranchised, and it's a very sad thing. So I'm going to end this episode there. Food for thought. Is Secessio Plebis an ancient tool for the modern world? And with that, I wish all of you listening to this great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.